In the grand and terrible tapestry of human conflict, certain threads gleam with an unnatural strangeness, moments so bizarre they defy the grim logic of war. We have read the Chronicles, the epic sweep of China's romance of the Three Kingdoms, the patriotic fervor of Vietnam's imperial Lei dynasty unification chronicle, the soul-searching grandeur of Russia's war and peace. In these accounts, and countless others, we learn that negotiation is as much a weapon of war as the cannon and the sword. Envoys cross battle lines under flags of truce, their words a continuation of combat by other means. It is a common, even necessary, ritual played out between warring nations, a dance of diplomacy on the edge of a blade. But for a nation's second-in-command, the anointed successor to its supreme leader, to personally pilot an aircraft deep into the heart of enemy territory on an unsolicited, unsanctioned peace mission, this is not merely unusual. It is an act that verges on the insane, a rupture in the very fabric of history. Yet, in the spring of 1941, as the world held its breath on the precipice of an even greater catastrophe, this is precisely what happened. For reasons that remain shrouded in mystery, ambition, and perhaps madness? The deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, Rudolf Hess, took it upon himself to fly to Great Britain. His goal, to broker a peace that would free Adolf Hitler's hand to unleash the full, apocalyptic fury of the Wehrmacht upon the Soviet Union. What followed was not a diplomatic triumph, but a descent into a personal and political abyss, a bizarre diplomatic overture that ended in a prison cell and a death that continues to fuel conspiracy to this day.
The night of Saturday, May 10, 1941, was cold and clear over the British Isles. The island nation, a lone bastion of defiance in a Europe subjugated by the swastika, was a fortress under siege. For months, the Luftwaffe had rained fire and terror from the skies in the Blitz, yet Britain held firm. The Royal Air Force had shattered the myth of German air invincibility in the Battle of Britain, forcing Hitler to indefinitely postpone Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion. But the threat remained, a constant, visceral presence in the wail of air raid sirens and the shadowy forms of German bombers crossing the coast. Every unidentified blip on a radar screen was a potential harbinger of death. In his command center at Turnhouse, Scotland, Air Commodore the Duke of Hamilton, a man whose aristocratic lineage was as distinguished as his military career, oversaw the air defense of his sector. At 8:08 p.m., a report crackled through the static. A single aircraft, identified as a Messerschmitt Bf-110, had crossed the coast over Northumberland. The Duke was instantly skeptical. A Bf-110, a twin-engine heavy fighter, was a formidable aircraft, but it was known for its limited range. Flying this deep into Scottish airspace was a one-way trip. It didn't have nearly enough fuel to return to its base in occupied Europe. There must be some mistake, Hamilton murmured to himself. Was it a reconnaissance plane on a suicide mission? A lost pilot? The possibilities were unsettling. But duty was duty. Indecision was a luxury the defenders of Britain could not afford. The intricate machinery of the nation's air defense system whirred into action. Radar operators of the Chain Home network tracked the intruder's phantom progress as it weaved westward. Anti-aircraft batteries were put on high alert, their crews scanning the darkening sky. Spitfire squadrons were scrambled, their Merlin engines roaring to life, hungry for a kill. Yet the lone German pilot proved maddeningly elusive, using the terrain and the twilight to his advantage. Then, just after 11 p.m., a new report arrived, more baffling than the first. The German plane had crashed south of Glasgow. There had been no dogfight, no triumphant burst of cannon fire from a British fighter. It appeared the aircraft had simply fallen out of the sky, consumed by a plume of fire upon impact. Suddenly, Hamilton was jolted by a follow-up message that sent a shockwave through the command post. The pilot had bailed out. He was captured, alive and unharmed, by a local farmer. The captured airman gave his name as Captain Alfred Horn. He claimed to be on a special mission of humanity and insisted, with an unnerving intensity, on a private audience with one man and one man only, the Duke of Hamilton. The name Alfred Horn meant nothing to the Duke. It carried no weight, no echo of recognition. Yet the sheer audacity of the situation was compelling. A lone German pilot crashing his plane in the Scottish countryside and demanding to see a high-ranking member of the British aristocracy? It was a scene ripped from a pulp spy novel. Despite his reservations, protocol demanded he investigate. A mission was a mission. Miles away, under the pale glow of a waxing moon, the drama had unfolded on a much more personal scale. At approximately 10:45 p.m., David McLean, a farmer in the quiet village of Eaglesham, was startled by the deafening roar of an aircraft engine directly over his cottage. It was flying so perilously low that the windows rattled in their frames and the crockery on the shelves vibrated. The sound faded, then swelled again as the pilot circled back, as if searching for something in the darkness. Then, abruptly, the engine noise ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. Something was terribly wrong. McLean, his senses honed by months of listening to the familiar drone of RAF planes, knew this engine's guttural cry was different, alien. It was German. Stepping outside, he peered into the gloom, his heart pounding. Against the moonlit clouds, he saw it, a pale, ghostly shape descending, a parachute. Instinct took over. This was an invader. McLean grabbed his pitchfork, his only weapon, and cautiously made his way toward the field where the parachutist was landing. As he approached, he saw a tall figure struggling to free himself from his harness. The man was clad in a fine wool flight suit and handcrafted leather boots. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist. This was no ordinary airman. "I am Hauptmann Alfred Horn," the German said, his English surprisingly fluent though accented. He was imposing, yet his eyes held a strange, burning intensity. "I have an important message for the Duke of Hamilton. I must be taken to Dungavel House." McLean, a pragmatic Scotsman, agreed to escort the stranger to the authorities. It wasn't until 10 a.m. the following morning that the German pilot and the Scottish Duke finally met, their two worlds colliding in a small, guarded room. The Duke observed his prisoner closely. The man was gaunt, with pale, sallow skin and deep-set eyes that seemed to bore right through him. There was an air of restless, nervous energy about him. "I wish to speak with you alone, Your Grace," the prisoner requested. Hamilton, intrigued, dismissed his aide and the interpreter. When the door closed, the prisoner looked up, his expression shifting from formality to one of expectant recognition. "Do you not recognize me?" he asked. "I'm afraid not," the Duke replied honestly. A faint, almost triumphant smile touched the man's lips. "I met you in Berlin during the 1936 Olympic Games. You dined at my home." He paused for dramatic effect. "My name is Rudolf Hess." The name hung in the air, electric and impossible. The Duke stared, speechless. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alfred Horn was gone. Before him stood the deputy Führer of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler's right-hand man, the second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany. "The Führer does not wish to defeat England. He wishes to stop the fighting. I have come on a mission of humanity. My friend, Professor Haushofer, an old acquaintance of yours, assured me that you were an Englishman who could understand our point of view. This is the 4th time I have tried to reach you since last December. The other 3 attempts were aborted due to bad weather. I did not want to come while Britain held the advantage in Libya, as it might have been perceived as a sign of weakness, but now, with our recent victories in North Africa and Greece, our position is one of strength, and so I have come." But who was this man who would undertake such a monumental, reckless gamble, and what dark purpose had truly driven him across the North Sea into the arms of his mortal enemies? Rudolf Walter Richard Hess was born on April 26, 1894, not in the heartland of Germany, but in the cosmopolitan world of Alexandria, Egypt, the son of a wealthy Bavarian merchant. His youth was one of privilege, a world away from the trenches and turmoil that would forge his generation. When World War I erupted, the fiercely nationalistic 20-year-old defied his father's wishes for a business career and eagerly volunteered for the German army. He served with distinction on the Western Front, fighting with a courage that bordered on fanaticism. He was wounded multiple times, once taking a bullet to the lung that left him with lifelong respiratory problems. It was in the crucible of the trenches that his destiny would intertwine with that of a quiet, brooding Austrian corporal who requested a transfer into his company to serve Germany, Adolf Hitler. At the time, Hess barely registered the name. In 1918, drawn by the romance and danger of the skies, Hess transferred to the Air Force, training as a pilot just as the war was sputtering to its end. The armistice and Germany's subsequent defeat came as a profound personal humiliation. Like so many of his countrymen, he subscribed to the poisonous stab-in-the-back myth, blaming the defeat on a conspiracy of Jews, communists, and cowardly politicians on the home front. Adrift in the chaos of post-war Germany, Hess found his purpose when he reconnected with Hitler, now a mesmerizing orator in the fledgling Nazi Party. Hess was captivated. He became one of the earliest and most devoted members, joining the party in 1920. A year later, when Hitler seized control, Hess became his private secretary. While Hess lacked Hitler's demonic charisma as a speaker, he possessed a talent for writing and organization. He penned many of the early tracts that laid out the party's toxic ideology: anti-parliamentarian, anti-capitalist, and, above all, virulently anti-Semitic. In 1923, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Hitler during the infamous Beer Hall Putsch, the failed coup in Munich. When it collapsed, Hess fled to Austria, but in a demonstration of his slavish loyalty, voluntarily returned to Germany to be imprisoned alongside his Führer in Landsberg prison. It was here that their bond was cemented. In the cell next to Hitler, Hess acted as more than just a secretary. He was a confidant, an editor, and an ideological sounding board. He helped Hitler write and structure his magnum opus of hate, Mein Kampf. It was Hess who introduced Hitler to the geopolitical theories of his mentor, Karl Haushofer, particularly the concept of Lebensraum, living space, the idea that Germany was destined to expand eastward, conquering and enslaving the Slavic peoples. This doctrine became the cornerstone of Nazi foreign policy. From that point on, Hess was Hitler's shadow. He managed his affairs, organized his rallies, and served as his unwavering disciple. When Hitler ascended to the chancellorship in 1933, Hess was rewarded for his loyalty. He was appointed Deputy Führer, a position of immense prestige. On September 1, 1939, as German tanks rolled into Poland, Hitler addressed the Reichstag and formally designated his line of succession. Hermann Göring was number one, and should anything happen to Comrade Göring, then Comrade Hess will take his place. To the outside world, and even to many within the party, Hess projected an image of austere integrity. He was seen as the conscience of the Nazi movement, a man of rigid principles, less flamboyant than Göring, less sinister than Himmler, less venomous than Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels himself once praised Hess as noble, reserved, friendly, and intelligent. But beneath this veneer of rectitude lay a man capable of chilling brutality, a true believer in the Reich's most murderous doctrines. He was a driving force behind the Nuremberg laws that stripped Jews of their citizenship and was complicit in all the regime's early crimes. Yet a peculiar and ultimately fatal flaw existed within his devotion. He occasionally allowed a flicker of his own conscience, or perhaps just his own ego, to show. He privately disapproved of the Night of the Long Knives, not out of moral outrage, but because it involved Hitler murdering old comrades from the early days in Munich. He also expressed reservations about the violent pogrom of Kristallnacht in 1938, arguing pragmatically that it was a waste of valuable labor that could be exploited for the Reich. These subtle deviations, combined with his lack of skill in the cutthroat politics of the Nazi inner circle, began to erode Hitler's trust. Men like the cunning Martin Bormann, once Hess's subordinate and now his bitter rival, began to expertly sideline him. He found himself excluded from key decisions: the invasion of Poland, the conquest of France. His role as deputy Führer became increasingly symbolic, his power draining away to more ruthless players. As Hess felt his influence wane, the looming war with the Soviet Union presented a desperate opportunity. By 1940, Hitler was obsessed with the East, but the stubborn resistance of Great Britain remained a strategic thorn in his side. A war on two fronts was a nightmare scenario. Hess saw a chance to perform a spectacular feat of diplomacy, a masterstroke that would not only solve Hitler's strategic dilemma, but also restore his own flagging prestige and prove his ultimate loyalty. He began his clandestine planning in September 1940, using his old connection to Professor Haushofer to learn more about the Duke of Hamilton, whom he identified as a potential peace broker within the British establishment. According to some accounts, Hess met with Hitler for 4 hours in March 1911 to discuss a secret plan, though Hess would later claim to his British captors that he acted entirely alone. After meticulously studying maps, weather charts, and British defenses, he chose his aircraft, a specially modified Messerschmitt Bf-110, stripped of its armament and fitted with extra fuel tanks, giving it just enough range to make the perilous 800-mile journey to Scotland. At dawn on May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess climbed into the cockpit, took the controls, and flew west, banking over the Rhine and out across the hostile expanse of the North Sea, a lone crusader on a flight to destiny or delusion.
Back in the interrogation room in Scotland, Hess, believing he held the upper hand, laid out his peace offer. It was less a negotiation and more of an ultimatum, delivered with the breathtaking arrogance of the Nazi regime. "The danger I have courted to come here," he told the Duke of Hamilton, "demonstrates my sincerity and the Führer's sincere desire for peace with Britain." He then outlined the terms. Germany would be given a free hand to dominate continental Europe. In return, Hitler would graciously permit the British Empire to continue its existence unmolested. All he asked was that Britain abandon its hostile policy towards the Reich and make peace. It was a conqueror's proposal, demanding that Britain betray its allies, sacrifice its principles, and effectively surrender, all while German bombs were still falling on its cities. "The Führer will win this war," Hess stated flatly. "If not now, then in 2 or 3 years. I have come to prevent a needless slaughter." The Duke of Hamilton, though an aristocrat, was not a government minister. He possessed neither the authority nor the inclination to entertain such a proposal. He listened, recorded Hess's statements, and promised to convey them to the proper authorities. But his first priority was confirming the man's identity. Was this truly Hess or an elaborate decoy? The task fell to Sir Yvonne Kirkpatrick, a former first secretary at the British Embassy in Berlin who knew Hess personally. Upon meeting the prisoner, Kirkpatrick confirmed it without a doubt. The impossible was true. The news flashed to London, landing on the desk of Prime Minister Winston Churchill like a thunderbolt. Churchill, a master of political theater, immediately grasped the immense propaganda value of the situation. Within hours, the British government issued a terse, dismissive statement. "Rudolf Hess must understand that there is no question of his taking part in any negotiations of any kind. He will be treated as a prisoner of war until the end of the war." The game was over before it had even begun. Hess's grand gambit had failed spectacularly. He had imagined himself arriving as a heroic peacemaker, a Wagnerian figure shaping the destiny of nations. Instead, he was a common prisoner. When he was transferred to military custody and treated as such, his composure shattered. He exploded in a fit of rage. "If you miss this opportunity," he shrieked at his captors, "you will prove that you do not wish to reach an agreement with Germany. The Führer will have then the right and indeed the duty to crush England completely, and to keep her in a state of permanent subjection after the war. A few days later, his despair deepening, Hess attempted suicide by throwing himself over a staircase railing. He survived, but with a broken leg and a shattered spirit. His mission had not brought him glory, it had delivered him to humiliation, and a 4-year prison sentence for the duration of the war. As if to rub salt in the wound, the BBC, with its signature dry wit, began its news bulletins with the line, "No German cabinet ministers flew to Britain today." In Germany, the news of Hess's flight caused chaos and consternation at the highest levels. Hitler was apoplectic. His initial reaction was one of betrayal and incandescent rage, terrified that his unstable deputy would reveal the imminent plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He ordered the immediate arrest of Hess's adjutants and staff. But as information trickled in from Britain, and it became clear that Hess's mission was a failure, Hitler's rage turned to damage control. The Nazi propaganda machine, under Goebbels, scrambled to spin the story. The official announcement declared that party comrade Hess, long suffering from an illness, had become the victim of hallucinations and, in a state of mental derangement, had commandeered a plane and flown off to an unknown fate. He was an idealist, a madman, but not a traitor. Bormann eagerly stepped into the power vacuum Hess had left behind. Hitler privately told colleagues that if Hess ever returned to Germany, he would be sent to a firing squad or an asylum. Yet years later, shortly before his own suicide in the Berlin bunker, Hitler would say to Hess's wife, "Your husband was the purest idealist." Why did he do it? The question echoes through history. Beyond the desperate bid for power, Hess was likely acting on a core tenet of Nazi racial ideology. In the twisted worldview of Mein Kampf, the Anglo-Saxons were considered kindred Germanic peoples, cousins to be respected, unlike the Jews, who were to be exterminated, or the Slavs, who were to be enslaved. Hess likely believed that the British, faced with a choice between a reasonable peace with their racial brethren and a protracted war, would choose the former, allowing Germany to fulfill its destiny in the East. He fundamentally misunderstood the resolve of Churchill's Britain. He mistook a shared ancestry for a shared morality. His flight was not a defection. Until the day he died, he remained a fanatically loyal Nazi, a true believer in his Führer.
When the war ended, Rudolf Hess was put on trial with the other captured Nazi leaders at Nuremberg. He presented a strange, detached figure in the dock, often claiming amnesia. He was acquitted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but convicted of crimes against peace for his role in planning the war. He was sentenced to life in prison. Hess, along with 6 other top Nazis, was incarcerated in Spandau prison in Berlin, a grim fortress jointly administered by the 4 victorious Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. One by one, his fellow inmates were released or died. By 1966, Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach completed their sentences, leaving prisoner number 7 as the sole occupant of the massive prison. For the next 2 decades, Rudolf Hess was the loneliest man in the world. His existence became a bizarre and costly Cold War ritual. An international contingent of 32 soldiers, 20 civilian wardens, and 4 prison directors, one from each of the Allied nations, was maintained around the clock, solely to guard one old man. His life was a monotonous routine of walks in the garden, reading, and writing letters to his family. His continued imprisonment became a point of bitter contention. The Western powers, the US, UK, and France, repeatedly argued for his release on humanitarian grounds. By the 1970s and 80s, he was a frail, elderly man, hardly a threat to world peace. But for the Soviet Union, which had suffered an unimaginable 27 million dead at the hands of the Nazis, Hess was more than a man. He was the last living symbol of the Third Reich. To release him would be to dishonor their dead. Every proposal for clemency was met with an implacable Soviet "niet." Then, on August 17, 1987,
the final chapter of Rudolf Hess's life came to a sudden and mysterious end. He was found dead in a summer house in the prison garden, an electrical cord wrapped around his neck. He was 93 years old. The official verdict, announced by the British, was suicide by hanging. The story, however, did not end there. From the very beginning, his family, particularly his son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, fiercely contested the suicide verdict. They, along with many journalists and historians, began to assemble a compelling and disturbing counter-narrative. They alleged that Rudolf Hess had not killed himself, but had been murdered. The evidence they presented was significant. An independent autopsy commissioned by the family found evidence of strangulation, not hanging. They argued that it was physically impossible for a frail 93-year-old man, crippled with arthritis, to have had the strength to hang himself in the manner described. His son claimed to possess a secret recording of 2 British intelligence officers discussing the murder inside the prison. The motive, according to this theory, was rooted in the shifting politics of the Cold War. In the late 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, with his policies of glasnost and perestroika, was signaling a new openness. Rumors swirled that he was on the verge of finally agreeing to Hess's release. British intelligence, the theory goes, could not allow this to happen. They feared that a free Hess might finally reveal embarrassing secrets about his 1941 flight, secrets of potential collusion or sympathy for the Nazis before the war. To prevent these skeletons from tumbling out of the closet, they silenced him forever. The British government has always vehemently denied these accusations, but their actions did little to quell suspicion. An initial murder investigation by the police was quickly shut down by the Attorney General without public explanation. And, in a final dramatic act of erasure, Spandau prison was completely demolished shortly after Hess's death, its rubble ground to dust and scattered in the North Sea. The official reason was to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine, but, to conspiracy theorists, it looked like the destruction of a crime scene. Even in death, Hess remained a potent symbol. He was buried in a family plot in the town of Wunsiedel, Germany. Over the years, his grave became a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis, who would gather on the anniversary of his death to give the Hitler salute and lay wreaths. Fed up and fearful, the local Lutheran Church Council refused to renew the lease on the gravesite. In the pre-dawn hours of July 20, 2011, Rudolf Hess's remains were exhumed, cremated, and his ashes scattered at sea. It was the final desperate act to erase the man who was Hitler's shadow, the envoy of a devil's peace, and the last prisoner of the Second World War. But some ghosts cannot be so easily laid to rest. The mystery of his flight, the long, lonely years in Spandau, and the dark questions surrounding his death ensure that the name Rudolf Hess will forever occupy one of history's most enigmatic and unsettling corners.